I believe that this is absolutely the right thing to do if the United States weaponizes the dollar, which unfortunately it has. Then the BRICS have to respond. Of course, the renminbi will be central in that response. It's unavoidable, in truth.
Next, we have virtual speech from the speaker online. He is Jeffrey Sachs, renowned expert on global development issues, professor and director, Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. He's online already. Please show the video. So, Mr. Sachs, can you hear us?
I hear you very well.
Yeah, over to you.
For having me.
Over to you, Mr. Sachs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning to all of you from a dark, rainy evening in New York City. I'm very pleased to be together with you and also to have a chance to say a few words
about the current global macroeconomic scene. As I think everybody appreciates, the macroeconomic scene is as unstable and as unpredictable for the moment as our geopolitical scene. We have already a world that is shaken by conflicts, that is still in a way responding to the long shadow of the COVID period and the inflation that resulted in that, that is shaken by the breaking of long-standing supply chains, especially between the United States and China, and that, of course, is also being disrupted massively by the tremendous breakthroughs in technology. And in addition, of course, we have a U.S. administration that has a lot of unpredictability in the months ahead. If President Trump is true to his word, he will lead the most protectionist administration that we've had in decades. He proclaims himself an ideological protectionist. He believes that the U.S. economy needs tariff protection. He aims to collect revenues from these tariffs. And of course, another dimension of this protectionist policy is taking aim at China and actually aiming to hinder China's economic growth by limiting the expansion of China's exports in the U.S. markets. All told, it's clear that the macroeconomic situation is unstable and to an important extent unpredictable until we see the actual policies of the incoming U.S. government and continue to see the implications of the geopolitical tensions. In that context, I want to make a few recommendations, actually. I think it is fair to say, and even with all the high unpredictability, right to forecast that China's access to the U.S. market and almost surely to the European markets as well will continue to be hindered and I think even reduced in the coming years. I think it's likely that Trump will follow through on at least some of his campaign statements regarding the rise of tariff rates vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis Europe, and vis-a-vis even the North American partners of the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Some tariff increases are likely. It's already the case that China's exports to the U.S. market have stopped growing many years ago, and indeed significantly declined from their peaks. So there is no realistic prospect, in my view, even with negotiations ahead, of China enjoying any significant growth of exports to the U.S. market, and probably more generally to the U.S. and the EU combined. And we already see the implications of this clearly as one of the major factors, and I would argue the major factor in the current relative weakness of the Chinese macroeconomy. Of course, the Chinese macroeconomy is not weak by any means. It's growing at nearly 5%. Nonetheless, the growth has come down, and there is a real puzzle as to where the growth is going to come in the future. It is important to understand the nature of the U.S. policy vis-a-vis China. I believe it to be the case that this is a policy aiming not only at protecting U.S. companies, but also at deliberately trying to stall China's growth. And for me, it has a lot of similarity to the policies that the United States followed vis-a-vis Japan towards the end of the 1980s. In that period, even though Japan was a security ally of the United States, Japan was viewed as a threat to the U.S. economy because of its great success in manufacturing growth and in the growth of Japan's exports to the United States. And starting in the mid-1980s, the U.S. took actions to stop the growth of Japan's exports. These came in a currency arrangement, the Plaza Accord, which dramatically overvalued the yen. And then it came in a series of so-called voluntary export restraints, which Japan adopted, which were anything but voluntary. They were designed to commit Japan to stop the growth of exports of electronics goods, semiconductors, memory chips, and automobiles to the U.S. market. At the end of the 1980s, Japan's growth started to stall significantly, and as Japan's growth was downgraded, the asset prices in Japan plummeted. So Japan had a financial shock that was secondary to the trade restrictions. And in 1990-91, the stock market and land prices fell sharply in Japan. The bubble was burst, as it was described. And starting in 1992, Japanese growth slowed considerably over the next 20 plus years. This, in my opinion, was intentional U.S. policy. Maybe not to hurt Japan overall, but to stop Japan's competition with the United States. And Japan's response was to keep the yen strong, and rather than trying to find other export markets, it was to increase the budget deficit and use fiscal stimulus to offset the loss of export growth. Japan ran consistently enormous budget deficits for the next 2 decades and drove up the public debt to more than 200% of GDP and the net public debt to around 150% of GDP. I mention all of this because the situation in China looks similar, to me at least, which is the U.S. becoming protectionist, partly to protect the U.S. market, partly to hinder China's growth, and China's growth slowing as a result, and now the public policy debate in China, what to do, with the American advice to follow the Japanese approach. Keep the renminbi strong. Don't let it depreciate. Even Donald Trump is making threats that if China allows the currency to depreciate, he will retaliate, because in Trump's mind, that would be currency manipulation, and to run larger budget deficits. So the U.S. advice is to follow Japan. Of course, I don't credit the U.S. advice as being in China's interest. I think it is convenient advice that is not in China's own interest. So what is my own advice? My own advice is, first of all, that unlike Japan, I don't think China should accept a sharp slowdown of its export growth, albeit it should acknowledge that that export growth will not take place in the U.S. market. So China should be very aggressively searching for exports in other markets. Hopefully, Europe will not turn as protectionist as the United States. That's one very important area for China's economic diplomacy. But I think China has tremendous export potential in the entire developing economy, which is now a substantial part of the world economy, of course. China is the low-cost competitive supplier of the infrastructure that the developing world needs. China is the low-cost provider of 5G, the low-cost provider of fast rail, the low-cost provider of fourth-generation nuclear, the low-cost provider of renewable energy, the low-cost provider of long-distance power transmission, the low-cost provider of batteries at all scales, and many, many other advanced manufactured goods. So the U.S. says China has overcapacity. In my own view, this is, of course, wrong. China has enormous capacity that it should be exporting to the non-U.S., EU world economy. There is a major issue, however, which is that unlike the U.S. and Europe, a lot of the exports to the developing world would have to be on credit, basically. And here is a second recommendation. I would recommend expanding the Belt and Road Initiative. It has come into some doubt because many countries that are in the BRI program have some measure of debt distress right now. But my view is that what China should be doing is lending more to these countries, but at longer term. So rather than BRI being financed at 10-year maturities, BRI should be financed at 20 or 30-year maturities, giving time for the borrowing countries to achieve sustained high growth rates and thereby to service the debts from the China Development Bank or from AIIB or from the New Development Bank or from other Chinese financial institutions. So my next piece of advice is longer maturities on BRI. Keep expanding exports, expand the Belt and Road Initiative, extend the maturities of the funding of the Belt and Road Initiative. My fourth piece of advice, if I might, is to allow the yen, or the yuan, the renminbi, to depreciate more, not to take the U.S. threat or to view a strong renminbi as a mark of honor. The U.S. is protectionist. In response to U.S. protectionism, it makes perfect sense for the renminbi to depreciate against the U.S. dollar. It's basic economics. So I would not try to defend the yuan or the renminbi against the dollar. I would allow some depreciation. The fact that Trump threatens a kind of retaliation for that is evidence that it's the right kind of policy, in fact. It's not manipulation, it's what the market requires in the face of high protectionism. In addition to finding these new export markets, and part through extended financing of BRI, I would also recommend accelerating investments within China. So not just a consumption or budget deficit-led growth, but an accelerated investment program and public investment. Where would that be? Mainly in the energy and the digital transformation. China has a lot of energy transformation to get to a decarbonized energy system. It has all the technologies needed for that. It is important for China and the world that the energy system should be decarbonized. And I believe that China can and should lead the way. And that involves also increased rates of public investment. Yes, some of that will be deficit financed, but that's because it's not financing consumption, it's financing long-term infrastructure investment. I think two other quick points that I'd like to mention. In the context of a increasingly broken trading system, I do believe that there needs to be a true alternative to the dollar-based payments mechanism. The U.S., unfortunately, has not only gone protectionist, but it has weaponized the U.S. dollar. It's done that especially, of course, vis-a-vis Russia, Venezuela, Iran, North Korea, and other countries that are deemed to be geopolitical adversaries of the United States. It's frozen their reserves. It's confiscated foreign exchange. It has blocked payments. It has thrown Russia out of the SWIFT banking system and so forth. But China is very much affected by all of this because China's trade with its natural trading partners is also impeded, including by the threat of secondary sanctions. And for this reason, the BRICS have talked about introducing non-dollar payments. I believe that this is absolutely the right thing to do if the United States weaponizes the dollar, which unfortunately it has. My own advice to the U.S. macro authorities repeatedly was do not confiscate other countries' reserves and do not apply unilateral or secondary sanctions. But the U.S. Wants to weaponize the currency, and then the BRICS have to respond. Of course, the renminbi will be central in that response. It's unavoidable, in truth. And I believe that a digital central bank, digital currency, as already the People's Bank of China has been experimenting, can go international and can be the basis of international non-dollar payments. So I would recommend accelerating the digital central bank currency arrangements, especially among the BRICS, as a basic precaution also for China if things get really heated with the United States, which, sad to say, is not impossible. My final point is that all of these shocks hitting China, especially the geopolitical shocks and the protectionism, require a very clear macroeconomic modeling analysis. In other words, to explore the real alternative options that China faces. If China simply accepts that a slowdown means larger budget deficits to finance consumption, I think it will not be making the correct assessment of the situation. I personally would recommend continued high investment rates and continued export growth rates, but using finance as the instrument for achieving both of those goals. China is the world's high-saving economy. China's interest rates, because of that, remain very low. The prospects, therefore, to finance export growth and to finance domestic investment are strong. And that is the macro approach I would recommend because I believe that China's continued rapid economic development is in China's interest and in the world's interest. So thank you very much for letting me share these thoughts with you today. I hope that was helpful enough, and I look forward to the chance to be together with you in person to continue this discussion at this very important time. Thank you very much.
姐妹们总烦恼脸上细纹干燥与暗沉，现在起跟我一起放心交给 KS Royal Face 皇家颜值逆时奇迹系列。KS Royal Face 皇家颜值逆时奇迹系列，它添加5种 EGF， 专门防止肌肤老化，强化皮肤修复，增加肌肤弹性水嫩，轻松抚平皱纹，换回青春自信。KS Royal Face 皇家颜值逆时奇迹，护肤露、全效精华、精华霜，即刻启动冻龄密码。